Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're so glad you could join us today. My name is Tom Fazzini. I am the Communications Director of the Alliance for the Great Lakes. Today, we are going to be talking about preparing the Great Lakes region for large water users. This is a webinar hosted by the Alliance for the Great Lakes. We are a nonpartisan nonprofit dedicated to protecting and preserving our region's most precious natural resource, which is the fresh, clean, and natural waters of the Great Lakes. In service of that mission, we just released a new report that details how the Great Lakes region faces sharply increasing demand from large water users. The report focuses on three industries: data centers, agriculture, and critical minerals mining. The report finds that the region faces the prospect of water shortages, groundwater conflicts, and contaminated aquifers if serious planning, policy, and regulatory actions are not taken to address this increasing demand. In fact, it notes that in some places in the region, we are already seeing some of these types of conflicts play out. There has been a tremendous amount of interest in this topic since the report was released. We have nearly 700 people signed up for today's conversation, and it will be a good one. We are joined by three experts who will give us an overview of this issue and what needs to be done. First, we will hear from Helena Volzer. She is the Senior Source Water Policy Manager with the Alliance for the Great Lakes. She executes policy analysis, advocacy, and project implementation across the basin to achieve our agriculture and water policy goals. Prior to joining the Alliance, Helena served as the attorney at the Ohio Legislative Service Commission for over a decade, where she provided research, legal research, bill analysis, and legislative drafting services to members of the Ohio General Assembly. Helena is the author of the aforementioned report. We're also going to hear from João Ferreira, who is a regional economist with the Weldon Cooper Center of Public Service at the University of Virginia. João holds a PhD in sustainable energy systems from the University of Coimbra in Portugal. He's passionate about environmental sustainability, urban and regional economic modeling, and the impact of public policy on local and regional economies. His work focuses on improving our knowledge of the complex interactions between humans, the economy, and the environment, which is essential to establish a more sustainable path for us and future generations. João is the author of several publications in top economic and sustainability journals, and today is going to be sharing with us some of his latest research on the economic and environmental impact of data centers. We're also going to hear from Sara Walling. She is the Water and Agriculture Program Director with Clean Wisconsin. Sara steers Clean Wisconsin's work to protect and improve the quality of Wisconsin's lakes, streams, and groundwater, with a particular focus on establishing policies and programs that will reduce the impacts of Wisconsin's diverse and productive agricultural industry on its soil and water resources. She spent nearly 15 years in multiple roles at the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection, served as the first Agriculture Institute Director at University of Wisconsin-Madison's Division of Extension, and also served the Alliance for the Great Lakes as our Senior Agriculture and Restoration Policy Manager. A note about the structure of today's discussion: each of our panelists will be giving a short presentation to share some of their expertise on this issue, and then we will have plenty of time for your questions. You can ask those questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We will do our best to get to as many as possible. You can start asking those questions now as you're listening to the panelists' presentations. As questions come to you, you can be adding to that as well. As I said, we're very excited to kick off this conversation, and without further ado, I will turn it over to Helena.
Thanks, Tom. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. Just a minute, print my slides. All right, can we see that? Okay. So as Tom, thank you for the introduction. And as he mentioned, I'm the author of our new report, A Finite Resource: Managing the Growing Water Needs of Data Centers, Critical Minerals Mining, and Agriculture. So as you can probably tell, we have three primary sectors that I'm going to cover today. The first will be data centers, and that's kind of one of the features of the report is this sector, but it also includes other large water users such as semiconductor chip manufacturing and quantum computing, other large water users that would be connecting to municipal supplies, and we'll get to that a little later on as to why that is. And then critical minerals mining, the critical minerals that are necessary both to transition to green energy, but then also that are used within servers within data centers. And then finally, agriculture. We're seeing an increase in irrigation in places that we historically hadn't before, and we'll touch on that. So as you can probably tell, all three of these sectors have the potential to converge on this region and are large water using industries. So I'll start off with just this map of where data centers are located throughout the region. This probably gives you a quick idea of how data centers kind of tend to cluster around major metropolitan areas. You can see from this map. In terms of the number of data centers, Illinois and Ohio are kind of the largest. They're 4 and 5 respectively. But the number doesn't tell the whole story. And that's because right now, generative AI is what's really driving an increase in the size and scale of these facilities. So Gen AI requires this vast processing capability that only these really large hyperscale facilities can handle. And there's no hard and fast definition of what a hyperscale data center really is. In my research, I found that it's over 10,000 square feet in size, has over 5,000 servers, over 20 megawatts of load. So to put that a little bit in perspective, a data center using 1 million gallons a day of water for a year is equivalent to what 12,000 Americans would use in that time. They're using between 1 and 5 million gallons a day of water, and that's when a method of cooling called evaporative cooling is being used. So they can use a variety of different cooling methods. Why do data centers need water? Why do they need to remain cool? It's because those servers that are doing that vast computing processing get very, very hot. So evaporative cooling is really the most common in the industry right now. When that occurs, more than half of the water evaporates. So the consumptive use of that is very high. It uses less electricity, high water consumption. And there are these other methods. Liquid immersion and direct-to-chip uses water directly to cool the equipment, and it needs less water and electricity, but it can introduce contaminants in that discharged wastewater that comes out at the end. There are other systems like closed loop, where coolant is being directly delivered to the server racks, as opposed to with evaporative cooling, you have water being pushed through a membrane to cool and bring down the temperature in the entire room. And that's an open loop system. And then finally, air cooling. Air cooling has really high electricity usage, but from industry experts I've spoken to, is really going to be insufficient to meet the demands of AI. And so going forward, it's going to be a liquid cooling method that's being used to cool hyperscale facilities. So what happens to the water? More than half of it is being evaporated, as I said, in evaporative cooling. The rest of it is either discharged as wastewater or it can be recirculated once it's cooled down. Even recirculation, though, isn't forever. There can be pH and scaling that builds up in the hardware, so eventually that water needs discharged. When it's discharged, it's warm because of the heat that's created inside the data center, and that is regulated as a discharge. So just recognizing that data centers also have a need for wastewater treatment capacity as well, if this method is being used. Then closed loop and immersive cooling systems might resolve some of these issues, and this might be where the industry is kind of headed. I know Microsoft is building a closed loop system in Mount Pleasant, Wisconsin. Immersive cooling systems, Meta has said going forward, all their new data centers will have this type of system. But we'll see. These are the large players in the industry, and it's not clear if all data centers are moving that way. Another thing to point out is this nexus between energy and water. It may be a little bit of a shell game if data centers then shift to a method that just uses more electricity, because that still requires water for cooling. It just occurs at the power plant. Energy generation is one of the highest consumptive users of water because water is required to cool those turbines that are generating energy. So you still have water use, it's just occurring at the power plant. So one of the main challenges right now is we really don't know what the water use footprint of a data center really is. Unless the data center itself is withdrawing water, registration and consumptive use permit requirements don't apply. So when they're connected to a municipal system, that requirement falls to the water system to report. And so less than a third of data centers are even tracking their water usage. This is really critical because 97% of data center operators are connecting to municipal supplies. So a lot of them are falling into this category. And again, just because of this energy water nexus, we also can't calculate how much of that growth in energy water consumption is driven by the growth in the data center sector. And then finally, non-disclosure agreements are commonly used in economic development, but here they're being used to obscure water and energy usage at the outset. So we don't have a good understanding of how much water a project is even proposing to use in the beginning stages of the project. So now I'm going to talk about something called the Great Lakes Compact and the reason why the Alliance is interested in this work and why we got into this work. If you live in a Great Lakes state, you may be familiar with this agreement. It's an agreement between the 8 Great Lakes states, and there's an agreement that makes it applicable to the Canadian provinces as well. And what it does is generally prohibit the diversion of Great Lakes water outside of the Great Lakes Basin. That means we're not piping water to Arizona, we're not shipping it overseas, and that's the general prohibition. There are some limited exceptions to that. But what it also does is require states to manage their Great Lakes water use within the basin, including their groundwater use, have them set water and conservation and efficiency goals, objectives, and programs, and requires them to follow and use common water use reporting protocols that's then reported into a Great Lakes regional water use database. And I pull this quote directly from the compact because I think it highlights exactly what our report is trying to make the case for. And that is that these programs need to adjust to new demands and the potential impacts of cumulative effects and climate. So beyond the compact, states have their own groundwater management laws as well. And we took a look at these and found that they're really kind of inadequate for states to be able to curb or limit or halt groundwater usage before there's been some kind of resource impact. And this is key because between 40 and 75% of us Great Lakes state residents get our drinking water from groundwater. So Ohio, for example, relies on litigation to resolve groundwater disputes and has not adopted rules governing a groundwater stress area where there's been some kind of impact. Wisconsin has the ability to establish these groundwater management areas, but it's a specifically defined term after there's been a drawdown effect. So Wisconsin DNR can't establish them where there's a likely impact. It's after impacts have already occurred. And then Illinois is a similar situation. The Department of Agriculture there can establish emergency restrictions, but only after complaint and investigation has shown there's been a drawdown impact or that it's impacting public supplies. So complicating all of this, we talked about at the top, the other sectors, critical minerals mining, minerals like copper and nickel are found in places like Michigan and Minnesota and Wisconsin. And this is a water-intensive industry as well with high consumptive use associated with it. There's groundwater usage both during the mining process and then during the processing of those materials, creating mine process wastewater that cannot be reused at this point. There are some efforts to recycle that wastewater, but in my research, that's really in its infancy right now. Other industrial use, we have semiconductor chip manufacturing, quantum computing, other high-tech sectors that if they rely on municipal supplies fall into the same category as data centers, where they may have high consumptive use and aren't required to report. Then we have irrigation from agriculture really increasing. I just read today that August was the hottest month, driest August since 1895. So we're seeing an increasing drought during the summer. We're seeing seasonal variations in precipitation, and both agriculture and data centers are going to require more water in summer. Agriculture has been increasingly using irrigation in places like Northwest Ohio and parts of Wisconsin, places that historically had not been using it as much. This is important because in those rural areas, the source is often groundwater. And then a population growth as well. If you have these industries attracting economic development, you may see an associated growth in population as well. The public also requires more water, and that's something we need to be thinking about. And then finally, the Great Lakes region is not without its existing groundwater conflicts in places like Southwest Michigan, the Central Sands region of Wisconsin, Little Rock Creek in Minnesota, and then South Bend. We already have existing groundwater conflicts between agriculture, between homeowners. South Bend is interesting because in that particular situation, there's an EV battery plant and a data center, and it's suspected that the construction of those facilities have caused some residents' wells to run dry. So kind of one of the first examples of perhaps those facilities directly impacting public residents' wells. So what do we do about it? These are some policy solutions that we make in terms of the report. Regional demand studies, we need better planning in order to identify where water is available and where it's not. Some states that have already done that are Ohio, Illinois, and Indiana. But these programs really need to be ongoing. They shouldn't just be one-off projects and need to be updated as part of conservation programs. They also need to evaluate ecosystem and environmental factors as part of the demand calculation. Things like how much water is needed to sustain fish populations, groundwater base flows. If that's not factored into the demand calculation, you're not having an accurate representation of necessary supply. And then economic and development agencies and local governments need to turn to those studies when making economic development decisions about where to site data centers. It's great to do a study, but if it's not actually implemented and used for anything, then you've done a study, but we need it to incorporate it at the economic development side as well. And then transparency and accountability, I talked about the need for tracking and water use reporting requirements for all large water users, not just data centers. And then community benefit agreements are really something that can be used at the local level in terms of when offering tax incentives or abatements or things like that in order to involve the community in decision making, but they can also ensure that some kind of water resources benefit comes back to the community in the form of conservation and efficiency standards, using best practices inside the data center. There's been a lot of pushback. I have a few communities in Indiana here that have defeated data center proposals. And so this is a tool that local governments could use. And then also considering those tax abatements and incentives. Over the last 20 years, all of the Great Lakes states have enacted legislation to incentivize this industry. Michigan, for example, in its last package did something interesting by requiring data centers that want to receive that tax incentive to connect to available municipal supplies, trying to get this issue of not needing to build out infrastructure specifically to service a data center. And then finally, conservation and efficiency standards for data centers that aren't siloed from energy. So a bill that tries to do that outside the Great Lakes region has been introduced in Connecticut. That's something that states could look at. Recirculation, co-location with wastewater treatment plant to make use of that extra heat, and reusing non-potable water. Data centers don't need finished treated potable drinking water like you and I. And so there are innovative techniques that the industry needs to start being considered. Ohio and Illinois have formed chapters of a water reuse association to try and consider some of these things. So with that, I'll end my presentation and turn it over.
Thanks so much, Helena. I'm going to turn it over to João Ferreira for some background on his research on data centers. Also, you can continue asking questions. We're seeing some good ones come in using that Q&A function at the bottom of your screen.
Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Helena, for this amazing presentation. Thank you, Tom, for the invitation. Thank you all for giving the opportunity to be here and share with you what is my research right now. So I'm from the University of Virginia, but recently we have partnered with the Joyce Foundation to start looking at the landscape of data centers in the Great Lakes. So what I'm going to bring you all today is basically the preliminary results of our research and those numbers that we already are confident in sharing, because if they change, they won't change that much. So why does the data center matters? Well, Helena already covered that, because they are related with AI, they are related with the development of technology. The US concentrates approximately 50% of the data centers that exist in the whole world. And Northern Virginia is the place in the US that has the largest concentration. But as you can see there, other places around the Great Lakes are already starting to catch up. And so one of the particular things that we have been looking at also is the intensive energy consumption of these data centers, again, because as Helena mentioned, that has other underlying consequences that sometimes are overlooked by policymakers. We are at the Weldon Cooper Center. We have been working with Virginia government since 2019 on the legislation and supporting policymaking about data centers. So we have like a long established history of looking, recent history, of course, because this is also a recent topic, but on looking at data centers and trying to understand how can we minimize their impacts in the society, while of course also in promoting a balance with economic growth and other advantages that we all recognize in terms of AI, in terms of data centers. So the current situation and a state-by-state comparison. So we look in our project to what is called the S&P data on data centers. There are several out there. We could discuss what is the benefits or what are the major flaws of each type of database. But the one we are using is the S&P. It reduces the redundancy of certain data centers, follows closely what are the planned ones. Most of the planned ones are already considered those that for sure are going to be implemented. And so we track more or less like almost 3,000 data centers across the US, and 20% of them are located in the Great Lakes. So only Virginia and Texas have a number of data centers that could be comparable to the Great Lakes. And when we look at the distribution across the whole state, we have Illinois and Ohio first, then New York, Pennsylvania, and then at a different level, Minnesota, Michigan, Indiana, and Wisconsin. Again, these were the data centers that were built in December 2024. Well, when we look at the growth path, so one thing that is important to say that Helena mentioned is that data centers have been here with us. Like they have been part of our economic tissue for several years. The question is now they are shifting and changing. But if we look at the trending patterns, so if between 2000 and 2008 we had like 5 new data centers per year that were being built in the Great Lakes area. Then we increased for 10 per year between 2008 and 2013. And if we move for those that are for the period between 2025 and 2029, we see that now 21 per year are being built in the Great Lakes area. The problem is exactly what Helena said, is that they are also shifting in terms of their nature. So this is not the end of the story. So these are the planned ones that we see on the Standard & Poor's data. We know that there are many more that are right now being discussed. So when Standard & Poor's and in our project, when we consider that a data center is being planned, is because there is for sure like 80 to 90% certainty that is going to be built, because already has a lot of contracts in place. So that's why you see probably not as much as you were expecting in places like Wisconsin or even rural Indiana or rural Illinois, and especially Michigan, because Michigan has seen a surge in the demand after they changed their tax exemptions, which also tells us a lot how much this industry is still changing and reacting to different tax exemptions or more friendly environments for their location. But as we can see again, Ohio, Illinois, and then Indiana are the ones that are leading the location of data centers in the Great Lakes. Indiana, the area next to the Great Lake near Chicago. But again, probably different policymakers have different pictures for this. Like this was this is the data that we have from Standard & Poor's. Let me put it like this. But the problem is that the data center type is also shifting again. And so we are looking at, as you can see on the left, more hyperscale data centers in places like Ohio and Indiana, more wholesale data centers in Illinois. Wholesale are big data centers that sell part of their racks and their computing capacity to other big companies that want to invest. And before, what we were seeing was the called retail data centers, small data centers with a very moderate energy consumption that were sparsely located across all the states, and that would have like smaller clients interested in cloud or any kind of more advanced computing, but they were definitely smaller data centers. And even, for example, the telco data centers have been always here for a while. New York, for example, it has a larger concentration of cryptocurrency data centers, and we are not expecting that many new cryptocurrency data centers in the future, although these ones we never know, because they tend to be more secretive about when they are launched and when they are put in place. But for everyone to understand, on average, an hyperscale data center consumes twice the energy than a wholesale data center, 14 times the energy of a retail data center, and 50 times the energy of what is a telecommunication data center. So when we look at the same analysis, but now in terms of the megawatt of capacity, that we are looking at, we see a more a more sharp acceleration in terms of energy demand. Okay, and right now, when we look at the 2025-2029 trend, we expect more 1.3 gigawatts per year of expected demand from the data centers in terms of their capacity to be installed. So of course, data centers and their growth, particularly these hyperscale AI-oriented data centers, they'll definitely put some pressure in terms of what are the environmental footprints, the sustainability goals, while also promoting some economic growth for sure and economic impacts, but we can discuss that a little bit further. So what we are saying is that only until 2030, with the data centers that are already contractualized, we already expect that the existing power that is allocated to data centers right now to more than double in states like Illinois, Ohio, Indiana, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. Okay, probably Michigan also now, given the recent changes. So this is what we are looking at in terms of the data center demand. And so until 2030, for sure, we know already that the landscape is going to change and is going to change a lot. And so we should eventually try to have better data to look at these aspects. For someone to have an idea, like we have estimated, these are still preliminary results, but the energy consumption of data centers across the Great Lakes will be equivalent to the residential energy consumption of 8 million households by 2030. So, of course, water aspects are intrinsically related with electricity and energy demand. As Helena said, even if the systems that rely on air cooling and that rely on air cooling during certain parts of the year, a study from the Berkeley lab said that most of the impacts actually of data centers will happen due to electricity generation. We need to have better data to perform better studies. And so I think this report is a wonderful contribution for us to start looking at data centers and the relevance of data centers and how we should have these things into consideration because we need better data and we need access to better water data, particularly to know better what the impacts are. So in terms of the challenges, it seems that growth outpaces the growth of data centers outpaces our regional capacity and policy knowledge. It also will have an impact in our energy infrastructure. It of course is moving much faster than our capacity to build new transmission lines, to build new power plants, to even make solar advance and other renewable energy sources. So this was something that we have in mind. This study focus on the economic growth of the data centers, and that's something that a lot of localities are relying on. Let me share with you that when we released our report by November, the numbers that have been out there saying that data centers can generate a employment multiplier or 6.5 will be significantly lower, and that's because most of data center study are not relying on new data in terms of data centers inputs and consumption of inputs. And so we will revise those numbers and they will be much lower depending on the state we are looking at. But we expect that those employment benefits that stay after the construction phase, during the operation phase, at the locality level are much lower and will depend on the capacity of the locality to be capable of retaining some of the taxes that data centers can pay to the locality. And also what we know is that given the impacts on water and energy, that it's likely that disadvantaged communities will pay a relatively higher price for very little benefit of these data centers. So I love your findings. I love how they relate data centers with water usage, shows how much we need to do more in terms of gathering data. And so I think our priorities, the way you stated, are I perfectly agree with them, and the need for enhanced transparency, coordinated planning, and to have a growth that is linked to sustainability and analyzes the risks that this data center can have. So they are large water users. These are my final thoughts. States should move quicker to understand how to track them and to track their use of resources and to regulate them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, João. I'm seeing a lot more questions come in relation to what you covered, and we will get to that in just a second. But first, I will pass it over to Sara.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having me, Alliance for the Great Lakes. I appreciate being a part of the panel. And my job with this, with the panel, is to give a little bit of a perspective on the Wisconsin water use relative to data centers that exist in the state currently and what we are seeing moving into the state as far as proposed hyperscale systems and the implications for those. So this is a map that identifies a little bit more granular nature where our existing data centers are as well as our proposed. So The map on the right, the active data centers are indicated with the green icons, and these are really very, very small systems. They tend to be, 1 or 2 stories within buildings where servers are kept. There's a few, certainly locations where an entire building is housing small data servers and whatnot, but those are all really what we've had these in the state for a long time in the nation. And so this is something that we're used to when we think about what data centers are in the context of energy and water in our state. But however, the 5 that are proposed are articulated here. There's actually 5 plus, because I just learned about a new one this morning in the western side of the state. But it gives you a little bit of understanding of where they're being located, to what Helena had indicated, really looking around municipal centers to be able to house these for a number of reasons. Each of these proposed facilities are at that hyperscale level, and their campuses are all different sizes, but generally speaking, are really locating in undeveloped areas, and in our case, often our farmland. We already, for those of you who follow, farmland loss over time, nationally, but certainly at the Wisconsin level, we continue to lose our active and really prime farmland for food production at a pretty rapid rate every year. And so this is only exacerbating the issues related to farmland loss and food production in Wisconsin. And when it comes to siting and development decisions, we often, there's a number of drivers, of course, that are coming along with these. But in the case of, Port Washington, that facility is expected to be for 450 megawatts necessary for power. Its overall campus size is looking just under 2,000 acres, which is primarily prime farmland, to a cost of $8 billion. That's more energy than is necessary to fuel 4 million homes, and would make it the single biggest energy user in the history of our state. So that just gives you a kind of a reflection on how big these things really are, and how that plays into the current energy and then water use demands in our state, in particular in the Great Lakes region. Similarly, the town of Vienna is another new one that has come on the scene, which is just south of us in Madison. Or excuse me, just east of us in the Dane County area. And the problem with a lot of these things, the proposals that we're seeing, is there just isn't the level of transparency that we'd like to have, so that the local governments and neighbors, of course, to these potential sites have a better understanding of what they're going to be up against as far as water and energy use in their areas. As was mentioned with both of the prior speakers in a very quick form, there's a number of reasons why data centers are strategically being located. There's the factors really tend to be around land and land access and affordability. Certainly climate is playing a big role in pushing some of these centers north to our Great Lakes region, because we already have relatively temperate climates, and so it reduces those overall cooling costs potentially, and then there's lower risk of natural disasters. Certainly the demand proximity, being closer to the end users, is a necessary component and a factor in the decision making of where proposed facilities are looking to site. But then also the connectivity and the network structure. So locations that have really robust network infrastructures, multiple fiber optic routes, et cetera, tend to be areas that they're going closely for. Certainly overall power availability and cost weigh into there, but really what I wanted to cover as well is some of the legal requirements associated with with the local zoning and local siting decisions. So when we look at these facilities and where many of them are coming in, as was mentioned, there are increasingly becoming tax increment district exemptions and incentives that facilities are able to take advantage of in a lot of these jurisdictions. So there, for instance, in the Port Washington case, there's a property tax revenue that's being generated by a tax incremental district for the site that would eventually reimburse the developer according to that agreement. The agreement was with the city, with that tax incremental district that would have that reimbursement over the course of 20 years. And so it really does put a lot of strain on local governments, but it also demonstrates that for the most part, Wisconsin and many communities within our state are actually encouraging the location of these kinds of facilities. So that's certainly the case in the town of Vienna as well, where our local energy provider has been courting the opportunity to site data centers within its energy production jurisdiction to be able to bring in more energy users into their area. But this doesn't come without problems, of course. And so this is really where I want to spend a little bit more of the bulk of my time. In Wisconsin, we are lucky in that we are a very water-rich state. We have over 84,000 river miles, 15,000 lakes, 1,000 miles of Great Lakes shoreline, and 1.2 quadrillion gallons of groundwater. So in the scheme of things, it does seem that we are a fairly water-rich area. And so citing something like a data center shouldn't be as impactful. But as this map and the graph on the left demonstrate, is we already have a lot of demands on the current water uses within our state. So agricultural irrigation and the green dots on the right on the map tend to dominate a lot of what our groundwater withdrawals are taken to be used for. Cranberry production falling in there, as well as dairy farming. But then you can also see the municipal water supplies, the industrial uses, and then the other, which would include things like what we're talking about with the data center area. So what ends up happening is it becomes very challenging to try to identify where these uses are coming from. In our case, in the state, we do, of course, require anyone with a high capacity well to apply to be able to use that water. And so we have that ability to track water use in the state. Certainly other large water users are also required to report. But as was mentioned from Helena earlier, when it comes to data centers that are going to be tying into municipal water systems, those municipal systems do not have to report how the water that the entirety of the municipality is using is being allocated to different users, making it extremely challenging to identify how much data centers on their own are increasing the demand on the local water supply. This further indicates what was shared earlier, which is that power generation continues to be the largest water withdrawal sector within our state. This graph is a monthly average of water withdrawals by sector over the last decade from 2011 to 2021. And so you can see pretty quickly where power generation is that largest water user. And then across all sectors, what you're seeing here as well is an uptick in the amount of water that's necessary during the highest water demanding timeframes, which in Wisconsin tends to be in the summer when we have our warmest and often some of our driest time periods. That's further illustrated in these two graphs that indicate on the left our surface water withdrawals by use from 2023, and on the right our groundwater withdrawal uses by each sector. So it further demonstrates, when it comes to surface water withdrawals, power generation, and understanding how much data centers are really transferring the water use associated with power generation onto that sector and kind of relieving themselves from the responsibility and the burden of that data. And then further on the right-hand side, you can see how much some of our other water uses really demand large levels of water during those summer periods. And the issue, of course, certainly is, as our climate continues to change, luckily the Great Lakes region is anticipated to continue to be pretty water rich. Our precipitation is expected to maintain stable, if not increase, but it really ends up coming down more to the timing and the intensity of those rainfall events so that we do get the groundwater recharge that's necessary. And there's a lot of question marks around whether or not that is something we can rely on as a state. These competing uses for water demand have already been, shown to have issues, to create issues within our state. Over the last 20 years that I've been working at the agriculture and water nexus within Wisconsin, we've had a number of very dry years where water demand from agriculture as well as other uses can really impact our natural resources. So dropping river and stream levels, lakes drying up, have all already taken place. And so this extreme increase in water demand that data centers are bringing to very isolated locations within the state is only going to further strain the competition for those water uses. So when it comes to the siting and development of these data centers, we at Clean Wisconsin are certainly advocating for more of a statewide oversight approach, because it's very challenging to even identify when proposed data centers are coming in until they are well into the planning stages, and looking to the local governments and trying to adjust zoning ordinances and whatnot to be able to access the land base that they need to establish the campus. And with that, we'd also love to see, as was previously mentioned, and the report well highlights the need for increased transparency. Developers at this point are not disclosing their water and power use, especially when it comes to whether and how much they'll use when they're tying into municipal systems. And then there's also, of course, the question mark about how much the cost to ratepayers is going to increase relative to any new infrastructure that might need to be developed for both the water system and new energy production that's required. We'd also love to see more environmental assessments on these facilities. When Foxconn came to Wisconsin a number of years ago, they were specifically exempted from an environmental impact assessment, and we'd like to see more of a transparent approach where all of these locations must go through some kind of a level of an EIS or an EA. Further, in our state of Wisconsin, we have not done a Herculean effort of really doing our best to groundwater mapping. We really could use more resources to understand where our groundwater is, its depths, its quantities, and the potential for its longevity, how long those water resources can last. Certainly encouraging renewable energy as the source of energy for these facilities is something that Clean Wisconsin is advocating heavily for as well, so that we are not continuing to put additional burden on fossil fuel generated power plants that we are certainly looking to phase out over time for a number of environmental and public health reasons. And then at the local level, resources for local governments are urgently needed as well. Oftentimes in the town of Vienna, we're talking about a 4-person, 5-person town board that's trying to make decisions about whether or not it should change its comprehensive planning and zoning to accommodate these large data centers. And so there's just a ton of strain being put at the local level to make these kinds of really big decisions that are going to have very long-term implications for the local jurisdiction, the municipality certainly, and the residents within it. So increasing the transparency around public comment periods, allowing the public to have a chance to weigh in, and making a lot of the resources for local governments available to make stronger decisions are all components of what we feel like would be a more proactive approach to taking on this issue of data centers and really getting in front of some of the potential environmental implications that they'll bring to Wisconsin. And with that, I will stop there, and hopefully we still have plenty of time for questions and discussion.
We do, and we have a lot of questions coming in. Let's get to it. Let's start with something that kind of gets into everything that all of you have talked about. The first question is, given that states in the Great Lakes region already have regulatory programs to manage permits and authorizations for water use, what is unique about the risk of data center water use that can't be regulated using existing regulatory systems? Helena, I think you touched on that.
Yeah, I can try and
to
tackle that one. I think the main thing is that when data centers connect to municipal supplies, which the majority of them seem to be doing, 97% of data center operators are connecting to municipal supply, that water use reporting scheme, the permitting, the registration it doesn't apply. That falls on the water system to report its water usage. And so we don't have insight into what the water use footprint is of an individual data center. The data we have about how much water data centers use, some corporations have released, corporate sustainability reports that talk about their water use to the aggregate. You might be able to deduce from that how much water they're using, worldwide if it's a company that operates worldwide. But it's a much different picture when you zoom in on a local watershed scale. And so that individual data center impact is something that we just really don't have enough information to assess right now.
Thanks very much. We've talked about incentives for data centers. This question comes from Penelope. With so many communities providing incentives for data centers, can you talk a bit about the community benefits that are causing communities to offer incentives? And that could be for any of you, because I know that this kind of touches on all of your expertise.
Yeah, I think I can start and certainly let the other two chime in too. But yeah, I think that there's certainly an expectation that there's going to be job development around these. For instance, one of the proposed facilities is anticipating 2,000 jobs long term at the data center and 2,600 construction jobs. And so I know that that tends to be a large driver for local municipalities, especially ones that aren't, that have been seeing a downturn in employment rates and that kind of thing in their local areas. So, but to a previous speaker's point is that we really don't have a good understanding of just how accurate those estimates truly are and how long-term those are going to be maintained.
Yeah, I can also jump in here and just mention that in our study for Virginia, we kind of confirmed that data centers are definitely job creators, but mostly on the construction phase. Virginia is so intensive and concentrates so many and locates so many data centers that at one point, half of the construction industry in the state was allocated to the construction of data centers. And so we definitely estimate that approximately 70,000 jobs are created in Virginia a year related with data centers, but 60,000 of these are associated with construction. On the operation phase, these numbers are much lower. And what we also discovered is that many of the jobs that data centers are considering that they are creating are what we usually associate with what we call indirect jobs. So it's the cleaning crews they hire locally to come and clean the spaces, the security companies, is all of this. So I really think that when we start looking at data centers from the perspective, what are the kind of inputs they use? We go back at an idea that 40% of their cost structure is mostly energy. Then a decent amount also is water consumption. So at the end, these are resources that don't demand a lot of employment that is generated locally, especially like the electricity jobs are not even, don't have to come in the same locality or don't have to be located in the same locality where the data centers are located. So these numbers start to go down when compared with the advocacy studies that are out there on data centers. And so we have to be very aware of this. Now, what I always say when localities ask me about the local benefits of data centers. We have a very different policy regulation landscape across, even in Virginia. I don't even imagine around the Great Lakes must be even more different from place to place. In Virginia, we have places like Loudoun County where a lot of data centers are located. Let's imagine an $150 million data center. This data center would pay approximately $8 million to Loudoun County a year between property taxes and business taxes related with the capital investments that it does. If that data center is located in Wise County, also in Virginia, it would pay $0.4 million. So imagine what the difference that it makes for a local government to have 8 million a year or 0.4 million a year to face the externalities and to face like the negative effects and compensate that at the local level. I'm afraid that if we start only thinking that data centers bring economic development, we might see what we call the race to the bottom between the different localities and the different states. And we are already seeing that in terms of the state tax exemptions. And we really need to be careful about that, because if data centers create energy, and to the point that Sarah was making in terms of the electricity rates, if they have impacts in terms of water usage, if we throw away our only capacity to balance this, that is keeping them paying the taxes that might us build the infrastructure or create regulations that kind of balance their impacts, I think we might be in trouble, because then we are giving away the only possibility for the local communities to keep some local benefits.
Thank you. We're getting a lot of questions about the technologies related to data centers. And so I just want to ask one overall question, and then I'm going to get into a little bit more specifics. And the overall question is, do we have enough information or transparency to understand whether there are new technologies that will make data centers more efficient? And the kinds of things people are asking about are non-evaporative cooling, and if that is emerging, if reclaimed water can be used for cooling purposes, if chip makers might develop software that needs less computing power, if there is anywhere with good information about this where people can compare the energy and water use of different systems that different data centers use. I'm wondering if anyone has any thoughts on this.
I think that would be nice to have, but we don't have it. But what I will say, and what I mentioned at the end of my presentation, is that I think that this is starting to be considered. So I mentioned the Water Reuse Association has these chapters in Ohio and Illinois that's starting to look at, what are, how can we facilitate non-potable reuse, conservation and efficiency standards I mentioned as well. We don't know what the best practices are inside of the data center. We can't really evaluate right now what's a better practice, what's not. And so in terms of setting those conservation and efficiency standards, I'm hopeful that those chapters can start to have those conversations and begin that dialogue of like, what is more, because if you're conserving water and using more electricity, that whole water energy nexus needs to be considered. You can't consider water conservation standards without considering energy at the same time. So it's a really difficult problem to solve, but I think that the solutions also need to start to come from industry. So I'll leave it there and see if anyone else has others.
We had a question about groundwater use. So in the report, or in your presentation, Helena, you mentioned that 40 to 75% of Great Lakes residents get drinking water from groundwater. That seems like a wide range, and I'm wondering, the individual was wondering if you could kind of comment on that.
Yeah, it's a wide range, because we're talking about 8 different states, and so it really just depends on the communities, the aquifer resources, what's where people live, where the metropolitan areas are. All of those kinds of things factor in. I can tell you that around the 40% mark is Ohio, and I think around 75% is Wisconsin. Within there, are the other states. So if that gives you a little bit more perspective, but which water source they may be relying on just kind of depends on where you're talking about.
And regarding transparency, 2 related questions. One is from Allie. Do we know of any legislation addressing the lack of transparency around water usage currently? And relatedly, can NDAs be banned so that information is available?
Yes and yes. So one of the things that, solutions that we have recommended in the report is kind of requiring disclosure at the siting stage of water and energy use. And there is legislation that tries to do this. I know New York had a piece of legislation that only did it from the energy side. I know Indiana had a piece of legislation recently introduced, and Illinois as well also had a requirement. And so the states tackle who that reporting entity is a little bit differently in each state, depending on if it's a public utilities commission or who the entity is to report that information. But by requiring disclosure at the outset, I think it does a couple of things. One, it increases public transparency, but 2, it also requires requires, the data centers to get realistic about how much water and energy they're going to use. And that would help inform our demand calculations and predictions. When we talk about the regional demand studies and calculating out, how much water will be available, that is going to factor in, and it doesn't accurately inform demand if we don't have an understanding of how much water and energy is going to be used. So I'll leave it there.
Great. Shifting gears just a little bit. I know we talked about large water users in the report, and it wasn't specifically focused on data centers because there are other large water users in the region that are expected to grow. There was a question about what are the projections for water demand for the critical minerals sector in the region?
Yeah, this is another difficulty because a lot of there is no specific water use reporting category specific to mining. And so the states tackle how they report mining water use a little bit differently. And it's also captured within different buckets of either public supply or industrial supply. I think in the report, we talk about how the most recent data I was able to find from USGS talks about the mining industry withdrew 4 billion gallons a day, about 1% of all withdrawals. That's nationally. And groundwater was the source for 72% of it. And when surface water was withdrawn, it's 77% of it was from a freshwater source. Now that also includes, I believe, like petroleum exploration, the use of water for that. So the oil and gas industry's water usage as well. So again, when we talk about large water users and the lack of transparency, some of the things that we're talking about are applicable regardless of who the large water users is. And so that's one of the main themes of the report is we looked closely at these three sectors, but really getting a more holistic approach to managing both groundwater and surface water withdrawals, use of public supply as well, is something the states need to get a handle on as we're seeing this influx of demand. And so with mining, a lot of it really is going to depend on the price of the actual mineral being extracted and which minerals are in the highest demand. And a lot of that is really hard to predict right now, so we don't have a good estimate on that. But that's about the best I can say there.
I'm going to shift, and maybe, João, this is a question you might be able to weigh in on. We had some questions on the international picture and if there are other countries that are doing a good job of managing data center water demand or energy demand, and also comparing the number of data centers that are being built in the Great Lakes region with maybe what's happening internationally, if there's any comparable areas, just to kind of give some context and perspective there.
Sure. So what we are seeing right now in the US is a little bit unprecedented. So the only areas in the world that can compare with this is like parts of China. And so we don't have that much data on what's going on there. And so all other data centers are sprawled around the world in different capitals in Europe. Like what we know is that data centers are mostly locating in urban areas. There were some questions about where data centers tend to locate. These are mostly very wealthy firms that don't care that much about land prices. There are a couple of old regional economist papers from 2015 that would consider that the best location for data centers would be middle of Montana because land is super cheap and could locate anywhere. But that's not true. Apparently, it makes a difference for data centers, especially for certain services of data centers, to be located near urban areas because of the dependency they have on good fiber optics network and the need for low latency. And also redundancy on the systems. You want to make sure that if something goes wrong in your network, like you can use other systems and it doesn't compromise the entire quality of the internet that you are using. So internet quality matters, and that's why they are locating in urban areas. And that's why, also related to one question that someone did before, why Virginia? Well, because Virginia is where most of the ocean cables are connected to the US, And because of the government infrastructure, that's where the internet is faster and more reliable in the country. So this is the reason, and this is the same reason for the Great Lakes. So when we look at data centers worldwide, and I've been having this conversation in some other venues, the data centers nationwide, only 3% are located in rural areas. So, and many rural areas have seen data centers as a potential for economic development. I'm not saying it won't happen, especially with the big, large hyperscale data centers that, for example, we are seeing in certain places in Texas. But it will be always located to a good communication infrastructure, and probably it won't be enough cases for us to say that there is the potential here for a new rural economic development. So they will continue to locate mostly in urban areas. And right now, the Great Lakes, in terms of what we see in the US, they are definitely they are on the top 5 of the places that we are locating, with Columbus, Ohio, Chicago being definitely among the 10 cities and 10 MSAs that are locating more data centers in the whole US. So that's where we are right now. Another place is Georgia, Atlanta, another cities in Texas, California, where we would expect it's not happening so fast. Probably they don't have a tax exemption on data centers, so there's not a lot of incentives there to locate data centers. So this also matters. New York and New Jersey was one of the places that we saw data centers locating first, but they were very related with crypto. So things are shifting, and again, we still need more data to understand what these location patterns and how they can follow in the next years.
Thanks very much. We are at time. I want to thank our panelists for their insightful comments and sharing their expertise with all of us. I want to thank all of you out there for joining us today. You can find more information about the report at greatlakes.org/water use. We will follow up within 24 hours with an email that has a link to the recording of this webinar. And finally, your support makes this work possible, so consider making a donation on our website to make sure this work continues well into the future. We appreciate all of the support that you give. Thank you for your interest in protecting the lakes. We look forward to you staying in touch and joining us at some point soon again. Again, thank you all. Bye.